afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to Amazon Crossing's New in Translation. I'm Elizabeth DeNoma. I'm a senior acquisitions editor for Amazon Crossing. I've worked on the team since 2014. And Amazon Crossing launched in 2010 to introduce readers to authors from around the world with translation of foreign language books, making award-winning, best-selling, and important contemporary books accessible to many readers for the first time. We publish translation in English, German, Italian, Spanish, and French, and are now one of the largest publishers of translated literature in the United States. We're interested in bringing a wide diversity of voices that reflect a broader collection of cultural experiences. And here at this table, we have 4 such voices. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of them, and then they'll read. I'll introduce them before they read and discuss their author. And then when everyone is read, we'll have some Q&A. And then after that, there will be books to pick up at the barrier in the back of the seating here. And there is a panel directly after us, so we'll just be mindful of that. Okay, to my left, immediately to my left is Simon Bruni. Simon Bruni is a freelance translator from Spanish. His published literary translations include novels, short stories, and video games, while his nonfiction translations include books and magazine articles in the field of social sciences, humanities, and sport. He studied Hispanic Studies and Linguistics at Queen Mary University of London and holds an MA in Literary Translation from the University of Exeter. He's a 2-time winner of a John Dryden Prize in 2011 for the novel Cell 211 by Francisco Perez Gandul, and in 2015 for the short story The Porcelain Boy by Paul Penn. His translation of Penn's second novel, The Light of the Fireflies, has just been published by Amazon Crossing. Simon?
Over to me, is it?
Yes,
okay.
Please, take it away.
So I'll be reading from Paul Penn's The Light of the Fireflies. Paul Penn's a Spanish author, believe it or not, who I brought to Amazon Crossing. He captured my imagination when he commissioned me a couple of years ago to translate a sample for him. And this is the result. So here we go. On the night I asked my father the question, my family had been 5 years in the basement, 5 years since the fire. It hadn't been quite so long for me. I was born just after they went down there. Why can't we go out? Dad amended the wall calendar and sat at the table, the large one we had in the main space where living room, kitchen, and dining room merged. What would you want to go out for? He replied. All your family are here. Mom lowered her head, her chin touching her chest. I think she also shut her eyes. There wasn't much light down there, just the bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Sometimes I thought of them as suicide victims, glass bodies hanged and swinging from a cable. Come here, son. Dad pushed his chair back and slapped his knee a couple of times. I walked over to him, dragging my feet. I could feel the cold of the floor through a hole in the heel of my pajamas. I still wore the type with feet. Dad took hold of me under the armpits, lifted me up, and sat me on his lap. As I often did in the early days, down in the basement, I held my hand to his face. I liked the feel of his burned skin. From his left eye to the corner of his mouth, the irregular folds of his deformed features were appealing to a child's touch. Stop it, he complained, lowering my arm. I want you to look around you, at your family. My mother, brother, and grandma turned to me, everyone except my sister, who was looking away. And the one who's not facing you, said my father, she's part of the family too. The white mask turned on its neck then and fixed its eyes on me. See them, Dad asked. Them, you, and me, we're all we need. There's nothing worthwhile up there. Do you remember when your mother splashed you with hot oil when she was cooking? It had happened a few weeks earlier, while Mum was making breakfast. The darkness of the basement and the shadows that danced around, distorting reality with each gentle sway of the light bulbs, made some tasks difficult. The morning she splashed me with oil, I'd gotten between her legs and made her trip. It was actually my fault. Do you remember how much the blister hurt? The one you had here, my father went on. He opened my hand to examine the back of it. He pointed at the exact place where the blister had been. There was no trace of it anymore. You're covered in drool. When are you going to stop sucking your fingers? He barely moved his head, but looked at my mother for a second. Do you remember how much that little bubble hurt? little bubble of liquid hurt? He asked again, pinching the back of my hand. Well, the world up top is made of bubbles like that, but not little ones like yours. He pinched harder with his fingers, making it hurt as if the blister had grown back again. Up there, outside, the bubbles are 100 times bigger. You wouldn't be able to stand the pain. He began twisting with his fingers, pain that would finish you off as soon as you set foot outside this basement. I opened my mouth but said nothing. I was stopped by the pain on the back of my hand, much worse than I'd felt from the blister when it was still there, and the pain in my wrist, which my dad wasn't aware he was crushing. I remember the snotty sound in my throat, the dampness of my cheeks. Stop, please. It was Mum who said it, her voice barely a whisper. Dad let go. The pain lasted a while longer. See how you don't want to leave this place? If you can barely stand that, what would happen to you out there? He stroked my wrist and kissed the spot where the blister had been, reddened again by the pinch. There, little soldier. It's not so bad. Daddy doesn't want to hurt you. He just wants you to understand. You have to learn that this is the best place you could be, the best place in the world. Do you want to touch my face? He moved my hand to his scars and let me stroke them. He knew I liked it. He managed to calm me down. I used to linger on a line of hard hair that sprouted from the fold across his cheek, a place where Dad couldn't shave. It was like a scar of hair. I liked running my fingertips down it. Anyway, he said, shaking his head and moving my fingers away, who said you can't go out? My grandmother snatched her hands back from the table. I saw them disappear underneath. Something changed in the posture of my siblings, too. They straightened up, their backs rigid. Mum kept her head bowed. The door's there, my father continued, gesturing at it. With the other hand, he grabbed my head and forced me to look at it. It's a few steps away, and it's open. It's always open. Who told you otherwise? In silence, he looked around the table. Was it your mother? Your brother or sister? Was it her? He tipped his chin at my sister. She likes to talk too much, because I don't think it would have been Grandma. She knows full well the door's always open. My father grabbed me under the armpits once more to lower me from his knees and leave me standing on the ground. I felt the chill of the tiles. Come on. He gave me a slap on the backside. Go over to the door, see for yourself. I wanted to look at my mother, but Dad held my head and made me look straight ahead. Go on, leave if you want. The second slap on the buttocks was harder, so I had to take a step forward to stop myself falling. Open that door and go. That's what you want, isn't it? So do it. Leave, and forget about us. We'd rather stay here. Behind me, I heard a chair scrape along the floor, as if someone was about to get up, but nobody did. I took another step. The basement smelled of carrot. I loved that smell. It was the smell of night. The only thing that told me it was day or night was the patch of sun that went from one side of the living room floor to the other, and seeped through some crack in the ceiling. The smell of carrot always came when the patch disappeared. If I left the basement, I would never have Mum's carrot soup again. An unexpected feeling of loss stopped me in my tracks. I had an urge to return to Dad's lap and scratch my fingers down his scar. Are you still there? He yelled. Come on, run to the door, open it and go. Leave this basement if you're so keen to know what's out there. I walked towards the door without stopping. I'd never been so close to it. A door loses its meaning if you don't ever go through it. It becomes a wall. Standing in front of it, I began to suck my fingers. I was sweating. I observed everyone at the table. Mum had looked up again. There was a glisten in her eyes now. Dad was sitting with his legs open, turning in his chair. He raised a hand and waved me goodbye. Dribble was running down my forearm. I looked at the door again. I took my fingers out of my mouth and reached up to the handle, several inches above my head. The first time I tried to grab it, the spit made my hand slip off. I dried my fingers on my pajama legs and held my breath so I couldn't smell Mum's carrot soup. And to fill the void, I felt in my stomach with air. I tried again. This time I managed to grip the handle. Thanks. So I was just going to talk a bit about the experience of writing in the voice of a 10-year-old child. It's probably something I've never done before, probably something I've never done, might never do again. And what I found was I was originally commissioned to translate about 8,000 words of this by the author. And what I found was I got to about 6,000 words and I really wasn't happy with it. 3 or 4 days work, and just it wasn't a little boy. It was me or a neutral narrator. It wasn't a 10-year-old boy. Something clicked in the last 2,000 words. So it was a process of going back to the beginning and going over it again with this. I don't know what it was, but something had just happened. And I guess what I put it down to is the further away a character is from your own reality, it can take a bit longer to kind of get into that character. It's like it's a sort of process, a slow process sometimes of suddenly you find yourself in the shoes of this character, and then the translating becomes much more fluent and much easier. That's very much what I found. With working with a child narrator. What helped greatly was definitely the quality of the writing. I think when you've got vivid writing, it helps you as a translator really be able to imagine a voice. And I think that's one difficulty you can encounter with sort of less sophisticated writing, is that it's actually, paradoxically, it's less sophisticated. It becomes harder because it's less stimulating to your imagination. And the natural instinctive process comes a lot slower.
Thank you, Simon. Next up, we have Kenneth Dakan. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1964, Kenneth Dakan studied mass communications at New York University before spending the past 25 years working as a freelance writer, editor, voiceover artist, and translator in a wide range of fields, from cinema and travel to banking and contemporary art. Currently, he lives in Istanbul, where his focus is on literary translation from Turkish to English. Among the many authors whose works of fiction and nonfiction he has translated are Perihan Maden, Ayşe Kulen, Ece Telmukuran, Birol Aouz, Murat Somer, and Buket Uzuner. His translation of Ayşe Kulen's novel Love in Exile will be published by Amazon Crossing in the summer of 2016.
First of all, I'd like to thank my predecessor for introducing the idea of the challenges of less sophisticated prose and also the voice or mentality of a child. In my case, the narrator isn't a 10-year-old boy himself, and also we have a traditional narrator, but the memories of a boy or a childhood experience related even 20 years later present some of the same challenges. And I found that the text was sophisticated in its simplicity, but I think the translator can sometimes be in danger of falling in love with his own translation. So that's for others to judge. But anyway, I thought it was a particularly moving passage, and I actually stopped at the end of it and thought, okay, I've done enough work for today. I want to feel for the rest of the day the way I feel right now. I'm not going to spoil it by moving on to the next chapter. 1915, Merseyphone, Anatolia, and in this short excerpt we learn a bit about an experience that changed one of the main characters' life forever. Okay, we've been introduced to the character, and now we actually are learning more about him, and it's sort of a flashback. The Balayan family was just sitting down to dinner. From under the lid covering a pot of lentil soup, a plume of steam shot forth, hotly licking the expectant little face bent over it. "Come on, my boy, take your seat," Nana said. That evening would leave Aram Balayan with memories as hazy as fleeting shadows seen through a curtain of gauze. But certain details would stay with him for the rest of his life. The little cubes of crunchy bread on the table, ready to be sprinkled onto his soup. The smell of sizzling butter making him hungry, making him reach for the bread. His big brother's soup spoon wrapping his hand, just at the moment a fist pounds on the door as his mother is ladling soup into his father's bowl. The ladle hanging in the air, father pulling his soup bowl back, the knocking getting louder. Mother's arm still poised in the air, his hand still reaching for the bread. The footsteps of the servant running from the kitchen to the front door. Voices outside. Father pushing back his chair and getting up as 5 uniformed men burst into the dining room. Aram clapping his hands, thinking they are visitors, which always means presents, but his 11-year-old brother knowing better, coming over and squeezing Aram's hands, tight. Father saying, "Shall we go into the living room, away from the children," in a near whisper. The uniformed men following Father out of the dining room, shutting the door behind them. Mother springing up and running after them. Nana, wordless and stock still, staring with the eyes of an owl. Men tramping through the house. Mother running up the stairs, opening and closing drawers in the room overhead, rushing back downstairs. Aram following his big brother to the front door, to Father, and seeing those eyes. Father's mouth, nose, and cheeks a blur, but those eyes, sunken and black and defeated. "Boys, I'm going on a trip," Father says in a ragged voice. The uniformed men say something to Father. "A business trip," Father says, this time in Turkish. He opens his arms wide and pulls the boys close. "When are you coming back?" Aram asks. "Don't forget to get me a hoop this time, a red one." "Look after your mother and your Nana," Father says. "If I'm not back soon, look after them." "Go back inside the house," Mother says. The boys return to the dining room. They eat their soup, now cold. "Nana, why aren't you eating your soup?" one of the boys asks. She says nothing. Low voices, tramping feet, the street gate closing with a clang, Mother coming into the dining room, alone, face pale, motioning for Nana to join her in the kitchen. And that was when Nana stood up, and when Aram clapped his hands for the second time that evening and shouted, "Look, Nana peed herself. Nana peed herself." So anyway, that's enough of that. This author has sold millions in Turkey, and it's categorized as popular fiction. And of course, the question of Armenians and what happened to them is something that hasn't been written about much at all, let alone in popular fiction. I was quite surprised to find, and I appreciated her approach. It turns out she had a great uncle that she based this character on, and these are actually his memories that he'd related to her, so it makes it very real. I chose we were meant to choose excerpts that were particularly challenging for one reason or another, and perhaps discuss why they were challenging. I actually chose this because I thought it was suitable for reading, and my assumption was that it was very easy, and I just translated what was there, and this is how it came out, until I looked at it today, and I realized how these are very subtle shifts, and they're necessary shifts, and it is a faithful translation, but Turkish and English are so dissimilar. The tenses are different. The narrative tenses in particular are different. I opted to use the historical present instead of the simple past. To make things more immediate, I did change it, but in the question of fidelity and fluency and the constant battle between them, Edmund White's 100 little dares per page, I felt as though it achieved both. And again, on the question of fidelity, I thought, who am I being faithful to? There's the original text, but there's also the author's intent. There are the characters she has created. There are the scenes she has set for maximum dramatic impact in Turkish. So, again, overall, I thought it was faithful and fluent.
Thank you, Ken. Next, we have David Hackston. David Hackston is a British translator of Finnish and Swedish literature and drama. He graduated from University College London in 1999 with a degree in Scandinavian Studies and now lives in Helsinki, where he works as a freelance translator. Notable publications include the Daedalus book of Finnish fantasy, Maria Piara's coming-of-age novel At the Edge of Light, Johanna Sinasalo's eco-thriller Bird Brain, and 2 crime novels by the late Matti Joensuu. David has recently completed translations of Riku Korhonen's latest novel, Sleep Close to Me, and the first 2 crime novels by Katja Heikkapelto. In 2016, Amazon Crossing will publish his translation of Kachikechu's wartime epic, The Midwife. His dramatic translations include 3 plays by Heine Junkala, most recently Play It, Billy, about the life and times of jazz pianist Billy Tipton. David was a regular contributor to Books from Finland until its discontinuation in 2015. In 2007, he was awarded the Finnish State Prize for Translation.
Hi, everyone. So I'll begin by reading a section from this book, which is from the beginning of the book. The book is set in Lapland, the very north of Lapland, the border area between Norway, Finland, and Russia, in 1944, in a period that was called the War of Lapland, when, in a nutshell, it's quite complicated, but the Finns and Germans were somehow allied against the Soviet Union at this point in the conflict, and the Finns were using the Germans were using Finnish territory to attack the Russians on their own border. And so there was a period when the Finns and Germans coexisted in Lapland, and then overnight there was an armistice between Finland and Russia, which then meant that suddenly the Finns and the Germans became enemies, which created a whole lot of problems in Lapland and culminated in the whole of Lapland being burned to the ground as the Germans retreated. So this novel takes place at exactly this point, before and after this shift of allegiance between the 3 main protagonists in the conflict, and focuses on a midwife and her torrid love affair with a German soldier. And it is written in a very kind of earthy, strong Lappish dialect, which is, if we're going to talk about the problems of translation, we could start there. I could go on all night. But I'll begin by reading a section from the very beginning of the novel, which is the point where the midwife first meets the officer. I heard the sputtering and rumbling of a wood-burning car behind me. I turned and looked. Joni, chortling along in his destroyer Ford, shouted at me to join him. "Put your bike in the trunk and hop in. Lisbeth's having her bairn." Joni's lips twitched to the rhythm of silent curses. I hesitated. I'd been forbidden from ever setting foot in the Nakkala Croft. Up there they lived by the Crooked Cross. Big Lambery wouldn't like it, and Uno even less so. He believed Aune's healing powers came from the devil and had nothing to do with God. I cannot say why I agreed to go. Perhaps I wanted to prove to Aune that I could carry on God's work where she could not. Besides, at the Nakkala Croft, they still ate soft, moist cake instead of chaff bread. They dipped pancakes in their milky coffee, while the rest of the country had already switched to a coffee substitute ground from roasted dandelion roots. But the real reason I acquiesced was, of course, because I saw you. At first, all I noticed was a young lad hopping from the back of a German truck and onto the road. Spotless boots, despite the dust. A camera slung over his shoulder. Some sort of officer, I thought, judging by the insignias, though I didn't understand their significance back then. A Gestapo cape and SS lightning bolts on his shoulder. From his neck dangled a peaked cap with the emblem of a skull that was both frightening and exciting. You turned the camera's crank and pointed it at us. I was taken aback. This can't be good, I thought. There were rumors that the Fritz sometimes pushed away combustion engines. There were rumors that the Fritz sometimes pushed any combustion engines they found into the nearest ravine. You raised your hand in a salute and cried, "Heil Hitler, Bruder Rumrunner." I realized that you and Joni must have known each other. Then you turned to me. "Everything all right?" you asked. I was surprised to hear you speak Finnish. And right from the start, your voice seemed to me like amber and the heady smell of smoked, burned spruce tar, almost too dark and too deep for such a slender frame. "Heil Hitler, and the lass is fine too," said Joni, and rambled and rambled that he'd better be getting home because his sister had gone into labour. "This here's the midwife." "That's no problem," you waved your hand. "Halt!" And everybody stopped. You carried on snapping photographs, as though the enormous convoy behind us were parading along Russenstrasse for you and no one else. There was some confusion, as the mules didn't understand that the command applied to them too. The trucks braked and men bumped into one another. Then you turned and looked at me, and you didn't recoil at the sight of my crooked eye the way most men do. You opened your mouth to say something, but Joni reminded us of the imminent birth. Was it possible to hitch a lift to Nakkala on the Wehrmacht truck? Yes, it was.
Did you want to say?
Well, maybe we can come back to the issues of dialect later on in the talk. I mean, maybe it's, yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And last up, we have Poppy Toland. Poppy is a London-based literary translator working from Chinese to English. She has an undergraduate degree in Chinese from Leeds University and a master's in creative writing from City London. She has translated 2 full-length novels for Amazon Crossing, Young Babylon by Lunet and To the Sky Kingdom by Tang Chi. She's also translated Gay Fai's novella Flock of Brown Birds for Penguin and co-translated Shin Chiu-yu's Masked Dolls alongside Wang Jinlin for Balestier Press.
Hi. I'm going to read an extract from about halfway through the book, and the protagonist, Lu Xiaolu, who's working in the saccharin factory, he's just been moved to the electrician team. So instead of unscrewing screws, he's screwing in light bulbs. Not long after joining the electrician team, I was sent out on my first assignment. The electrician team leader wanted me to go to the refrigeration workshop to change a light bulb. The electrician team leader was about 30 years old, and his nickname was Chickenhead. Chickenhead gave me a light bulb, telling me to be careful not to put it into a socket of the wrong voltage, or it would create a miniature bomb. Shards of glass would fly in my eyes, blinding me. I gingerly took hold of the light bulb, and Chickenhead repeated that I was to go to the refrigeration workshop to find Huang Chunmei. "Who's Huang Chunmei?" I asked. "An extremely fat girl, about twice your width. You won't have a problem recognizing her. If you can't find her, ask anyone. They all know Huang Chunmei in the refrigeration workshop." His description made me feel uneasy. Chickenhead saw this and frowned. "What are you afraid of? A fat girl really scare you that much? What would you do if you ever met a thin girl?" He spoke in a slangy dialect that made him difficult to understand. Chickenhead called another young worker over and told him to go with me. His name was Xiao Li, and I hadn't met him before. Xiao Li told me that he'd just been transferred over from the rubber factory. "I've seen Huang Chunmei before," he said. "She's very fat." "Yep, that's her," Chickenhead said, "a fat tiger." The 2 of us set off for the refrigeration workshop. Xiao Li was a year older than I was, and he had been to technical college, where he trained as an electrician. We were both new, and together we felt more confident. So, carrying a light bulb, shouldering the ladder, and whistling a tune, we went in search of the fat tiger. Xiao Li and I arrived at the workshop and peered through into the control room. It was a ghost town, without a person in sight, and there was certainly no Huang Chunmei. "Huang Chunmei!" Xiao Li called out brightly. "Huang Chunmei!" But the boom of machinery, a noise like a jet roaring overhead, stopped his voice from carrying. We split up to search, and in a little while, Xiao Li dashed over, saying he'd found Huang Chunmei. I followed him to the far corner of the room, where some women's underwear had been hung out to dry in front of the ventilator. It looked mostly like odd little bits of cloth, but in the middle hung an enormous white cloth bag. "So where's Huang Chunmei?" I asked Xiao Li. Xiao Li pointed at the big cloth bag and cried, "This must be Huang Chunmei's bra!" The biggest bra I've ever seen was fluttering away in that dingy corner, white and poorly stitched, its straps in a tangle from the ventilator blasts. "This has to be hers," Xiaoli said, "unless there's more than one fat girl working in the refrigeration workshop." We couldn't help ourselves. Xiaoli and I felt compelled to go up to the bra and touch it. Even though we knew it was a fairly disgusting thing to do, we just had to prove to ourselves that we weren't hallucinating. "So we found her fucking bra," I said. "What good does that do us?" "Are you dumb?" Xiaoli said. "All we have to do is stay near the bra and keep watch. Wait for Huang Chunmei to appear. She must have worn her bra to work." "Who says it's a goddamn bra anyway?" I said. "It's clearly a parachute." That's when a great shadow appeared, hovering the doorway of the refrigeration workshop, swaying softly. She shifted into our field of vision, and I knew for certain that it was her, owner of the parachute, Huang Chunmei. What I wasn't expecting was that instead of shooing us over to change the light bulb, Huang Chunmei put her hand in her pocket and fished out a handful of sunflower seeds. She squeezed them from her basin-sized fist into our palms. "Come on, have some seeds," she said. I grasped a heap of them, still warm from her hand. Huang Chunmei wasn't actually a tiger. She was just a bit fat. She had a nice personality. She stood by as we changed the light bulb, watching and chuckling, helping to keep the ladder steady. Later, she showed us a sweater she was knitting, an item the size of a mosquito net. She was still unmarried and nearing her 30s. Had she been a bit thinner, she'd no doubt have made an excellent wife. She even asked us if we knew any suitable men to introduce her to. Xiaoli and I exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to respond. Back at the electrician team station, I told Chickenhead that Huang Chunmei wasn't a tiger. Chickenhead didn't care. He just assumed all fat women were tigers, regardless of whether they had nice personalities. I told him this way of thinking was unfair. "Is your job really this laid back?" Chickenhead asked. "Had time for a chat with her, did you? Offered you a snack, did she?" Xiaoli and I nodded earnestly. Then we told him about the parachute episode. Chickenhead laughed his head off and told us we were sickos. A week later, workers from the plumbing and bench worker teams were all racing over to take the piss out of us. They were calling us perverts, saying we liked to look at bras, that we'd gone up to the bras to sniff them. Later, the story evolved so that now we were thieves, specializing in bra theft. Up against a crowd of our superiors in their work uniforms, Xiaoli and I couldn't have found the words to explain ourselves, not if we'd had 100 mouths. I think I chose this passage to read, one, because it was an anecdote that lent itself to being read and, it had a humorous thread, but also it brought up an aspect of the book that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable, which was the gender representations in the factory. And I think there was sort of different levels that this could be seen. I think in the 1990s in this factory, it was a sexist environment, and so the book is portraying that. And I think even we see the character in this scene, he stands slightly outside of that, in that he challenges his boss and says, just because she's fat doesn't mean she's horrible. But still, I think we still see him having a sexist attitude, that he doesn't think that she'd make a nice, even, if she was thinner, she might make a nice wife. And I'm not quite sure where the author's position in relation to his protagonist, but I think my position is a slightly different place. So I also think that that the book only works if the protagonist is a likable character, and I think that some of the time he's towing quite a line between crossing over into saying things that I think a Western reader might find challenging. And so I saw my role sometimes as slightly diplomatic and trying to kind of gauge when the reader would be really turned off by the things the character said.
Thank you all so very much. Let's give them all a round of applause, please. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I'm sure we have some time for Q&A and discussion. Is there a mic in the audience? Does anybody have? Okay, right up front. You want to just use this one? Okay. All right. Great.
It was, sorry, I've forgotten your name, but you mentioned dialects.
Yes.
And I noticed you used the word ban. And it sounded great. But did you have any thoughts about whether you should use ban and what other dialects you use? Not that ban is dialect.
Did everybody hear the question? Okay.
Yes. Everybody heard. Great. Yes, I thought long and hard about these words. Also, I mean, maybe a few words about the case in point. So the entire book is written in all the dialect, all the dialogue is in a kind of very strong Lappish dialect. And the prose as well is filled with words that Finnish is great for its ability to you can just make up words that sound kind of like other words, and everybody understands what you mean, but then you're being very creative. And this author loves to do this, and she also she collects words that she has heard an old lady say once in a village in 1983, and she and deploys them all in the text. So it's quite challenging on a variety of levels. But I was very keen that the English translation isn't fixed in any particular place. So it's not happening in the Highlands because these people are not in the Highlands. I mean, they're still in Finland. But I mean, my aim was really to introduce certain words that people will understand, and even if they don't understand them, I don't think that's a problem, because a lot of Finnish people have told me they don't understand a fifth of the words in this book, but they still kind of so to use vocabulary items that suggest a kind of fictional north to the reader, whether it's readers in America, readers in England, but without placing it anywhere in particular. I think the word bairn is quite good in that respect, because it's used in the north of England as well, and it's also a Scandinavian loanword, which is useful. Yeah.
Anyone else? Did she have the mic over there?
On a similar note, in a way, I've got a question for Simon and for Poppy. Poppy, at one point in yours, you said something like he spoke in a slangy dialect that made him difficult to understand. So did you decide to include that to cover all his language in the book so people would know how he spoke? And for Simon, I wanted to ask a bit more about whether you're conscious of how you got into writing through the mind of a 10-year-old, or whether it was just the process of absorbing it, whether you had any techniques that you used.
I'll just answer first because mine's very quick. No, that was just how he'd actually described it. It wasn't, yeah. Okay.
I actually found myself, the 3/4 of the book is written through the voice of a child narrator. And I did actually find myself remembering more from when I was a child, not events, but feelings, how it felt to be a child. And I think that's testament to Paul's work, partly because he made me feel that, which is what his books are all about, actually, of feeling and making you feel. Strong emotions, so yeah. But I'd also add that one thing I found was that a child narrator's voice in a novel is, in reality, nothing like how a child would write it, because if that were the case, it would probably not make an awful lot of sense, in the same way as if you if you transcribe a conversation in natural language, write it down, and then read it through, it kind of gobbledygook. So there's a sort of level of sophistication to the language which probably doesn't pertain to a 10-year-old child in reality, but somehow when the reader reads it, it convinces them that it is this child's voice. So yeah.
Simon, I think it was you who said that you approached Amazon Crossing with this book.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask the others as well, how did you propose the book in your case to Amazon Crossing, or how did it work, or how does that process work?
They proposed to me.
Yeah, they had acquired Ketto's book, and I agreed to translate it.
Mine happened the other way around, really, because Luné, I'd already contacted Luné, and I really loved the book, and I'd said I'd act as his agent, not realizing how hard that would be. In the meantime, Amazon contacted him, and he said, I'll go with you if you take my translator. So, yeah, it worked in my favor.
Hello. Poppy, you mentioned that you wanted to make the character more likable in some ways. Did you have to negotiate that with the author quite a lot in terms of sexual politics or whatever else?
I didn't want to make him more likable. I wanted to keep his likability. So I didn't think this was necessarily something that I needed to discuss with the author, because he doesn't know the readership that I was translating into, and I don't think they were they were judgments he could make. And it wasn't huge changes, it was just like negotiations with words and certain things that you just, in the first chapter on the first page, he says that he's walking along slowly behind his girlfriend, and he's walking like a cripple or something. It's just an offensive word, and you just think that's so close to the beginning, it's going to form a sort of negative impression in the English language reader.
Kind of terminology decisions.
Yeah.
Can I come in on that point, actually? And that's interesting because obviously the book I've translated is set in the 40s, in Lapland, and it was a particularly politically incorrect time, and the language really reflects that. And so there are lots of words that during the process of editing that we've really had to discuss that have been flagged up in the PDF as might cause sensitivity issues, but they just quite simply have to be there because that's the way these people speak, and I don't think it's right to really censor them or hold them to the standards that we expect of each other now. So.
I think I understood that they're all living authors that you've translated, and I'd just be interested to know whether you have much contact with them, whether you queried any cultural references, and then more generally how you feel about translators and original authors working together.
Should we go down the line on this one?
Paul, I communicated with him loads, and he reads English really well. So when we came to actually doing the book for Amazon Crossing, I would translate 10,000 words, send it to him, and he would come back with comments. And but he was great to work with. He didn't want to impose anything on the translation. He would just make observations and then hand it over to me. So it worked really well. Yeah.
In previous books I translated for the same author, I'd consulted with her over a few things, but in this book I didn't. I didn't feel I needed to, but generally, if the author is alive and available and I'm uncertain about something, I'm happy to talk to the author.
Well, I'm certainly happy to talk to them. but that doesn't mean I'm going to listen to everything they say. I mean, different authors want to be involved to a different degree and this particular author was quite hands-off, actually, which suits me fine because it means that that I can then work with the editors, and I think it's a much more fruitful working process, especially in a book that is so dialectical. And it also means you're working with other. I mean, to come back to the point of the first panel this morning, and by the way, I agree with everything you said, is that that you're working with other native speakers, and you are writing for a native speaking, or largely for a native speaking audience. So I quite like it when the author doesn't want to get in the way of that process, because it can be overbearing. Some authors can be very overbearing.
I was in a fair amount of contact with Luné, but he's a very prolific writer, and I found out if I asked him one question about the text, I'd just get a huge email about 3,000 words, which didn't really help sometimes. I just wanted just a little bit of a clarification. So it's wonderful to have like a working relationship, and I think when you're working on your own, it can be very lonely, and to feel that you're actually collaborating with someone is wonderful. But I guess it's really to do with the book that you're working on and how that can actually work in reality.
Next question. Going once, going twice. Well, if there aren't any more questions, then I'll just thank you again for attending this session, and remind you that there are books. Right over there. What? Oh, there is a question. No, false question. Okay, I'll thank you again for attending this session, and remind you that there are books right behind you there on the video. Thank you.